I'm in a crappy band with some old high school buddies of mine. A few weeks ago, our bassist Pierce informed the rest of the band that his parents had flown to Europe and left their house for us in Fort Collins. His dad is a sound engineer and has a recording studio in the house. We were ecstatic. So we packed light and made the drive from California to Fort Collins, ready to track a backlog of 8 songs we had been sitting on. It was mid-spring, and the mountains looked like they were jutting out from oceans of blue and yellow wildflowers. The drive was long, but it was nothing short of spectacular. In fact, it was so beautiful that one night after a recording session, Pierce suggested that we go camping. I laughed at the idea. They all knew I had a somewhat negative experience in the Colorado Rockies a few years ago. But Ronnie and Jeff jumped on board and insisted I not be a wet blanket about it. Pierce recommended some vanilla tent camping at the foot of the mountain, but Ronnie had a bright idea. He wanted to do some astrophotography, and for that, he said, we needed to go to a place that's really dark. So we spent some time Googling and discovered Comanche Peak Wilderness, a remote section of a popular national park. What a great idea, I remember chirping. Why, surely nothing could go wrong. Of course stuff could go wrong, and it started on the drive up there. People always forget that evening begins at around 4 p.m. in the deep woods. As soon as the sun dips behind the treetops, the gloom sets in and things get eerie. Nothing makes me more claustrophobic than the sight of that heavy murk sliding over the world. My body rejects it because my brain knows it's too early for dark. I was on edge the second that paved road gave way to dirt. The other thing people forget is just how loud the woods are at times, and how silent they become at others. The contrast between them can make your head spin. One moment it's a symphony of owls and crickets and toads, then a branch will snap, or thunder will crack, and suddenly you're wondering if you've gone deaf. And then of course, if you think about it too much, you realize just how full the darkness is with all those watchful eyes. We went in as deep as we could. We ditched Pierce's truck on the side of some forgotten road and hiked about a half-mile into the trees. There was no trail. We followed the GPS to a tiny lake nestled somewhere uphill, where Ronnie could set up his camera and get a clear view of the night sky. We hadn't crossed a solitary soul after entering the preserve a few hours prior, and I felt apprehensive about the fact that no one knew where we were. By dusk, we had set up the 2 tents Pierce had borrowed from his parents. We made a small bonfire pit between them and strung up all our food in the trees like you're supposed to do. Ronnie set up his camera along the shore, and then we waited for nightfall. My anxiety worsened as darkness ate away at the sky. The guys didn't notice. They drank and smoked and carried on. And right when the world went black, leaves began to crunch in the distance behind our tents. A girl emerged from the tree line and stopped at the edge of our little clearing. This girl was probably 8 years old and wore a white dressing gown, like she had just woken up. She had platinum blonde, almost white hair, and skin so pale she looked like a ghost in the firelight. She wasn't carrying a flashlight or anything. She had just been walking in the pitch-black woods. She squinted at our fire as if it annoyed her, and let out a few wet coughs. We all just stared at each other in confusion while she studied us. There were no roads or trails in this area. This was not a campground. Her presence made no sense. Jeff eventually called out to her, asking if she was okay, and she replied, "My mommy's sick. Can you guys help us?" Where is she?" Jeff asked. The girl just pointed back into the forest. The trees and shadows and mist clustered together to form a great big wall of nope. I gave Jeff a subtle hell no headshake. You might call me a coward, but I'm not about to get disappeared by some malevolent wood pixie. Ronnie stood up and asked the girl if they were camping or if they had a house or something. The girl just replied, "She's really sick. Just follow me." At this point, all four of us seemed to sense that something was wrong. Pierce, probably the cleverest of us, invited the girl to come warm up by the fire and explain what was going on. I think he knew she'd decline. The girl just turned and walked back into the woods, coughing as she went. Before she vanished, she turned around and said something, but we couldn't be certain of what. I heard, "So you'll be a liar." But Ronnie heard, "Soon you'll meet the liar." We built the fire up a lot more, mostly to keep a good perimeter against the darkness. All of us were creeped out, but after a few hours the guys had mostly forgotten about the girl. They laughed and told stories about drunken escapades. At some point, Jeff and I went to a tree line to relieve ourselves. I walked about 10 steps into the woods and blasted the darkness with my flashlight. Jeff followed closely behind. I wanted to see if there was a clearing on the other side of the woods, or a footpath that the girl might have followed. But there was nothing. Just a snarl of impassable trees. We heard Ronnie shouting something, so Jeff and I jogged back to the fire and saw him examining the southern edge of the clearing. That was the direction we had left the truck in. Pierce said as we passed by, he thinks he heard some more footsteps. I could hear them too. Standing next to Ronnie, I could make out a new pair of feet trampling the leaves in the dark. It was louder than the girls had been, probably bigger. "Show yourself," Ronnie shouted. "We have guns." To my surprise, a woman answered him. She laughed and said, "Don't shoot, I'm just a hiker." We moved back and watched her step into the clearing. She was probably in her late 30s and wore a raggedy hat and an old beat-up pack. I remember hearing Pierce grumble something like, "Real private spot you found here, Ronnie," and I agreed. How the hell were all these people just bumping into us way out here? The woman introduced herself as Sarah and apologized for scaring us. Ronnie demanded to know what she was doing out here, and she explained that she had done the full day loop around the mountain, but had gotten lost for a little while. She claimed to have found her bearings and now knew where she was going. "You know the way back?" he repeated to her. "Yep." "In the dark, without a flashlight?" "Uh-huh. I know this area pretty well," she said. Ronnie wasn't buying a word of it. He turned back to the rest of us and said, "We're getting cased, you guys. We're probably gonna get robbed soon as we fall asleep. Campers get killed by thieves and meth heads all the time." "Well, thanks for bringing us out here, dingus," Jeff said. Sarah laughed again. She was real smiley for a woman lost in the woods. In the dark. "I swear it's nothing like that," she said. "Look, fine, I'll be on my way." For whatever reason, I felt the urge to press her further. So I said, "You know, you're not the only person we've met out here who's walking around without a light." That little smile fell off of Sarah's face, and it took the wind right out of my sails. She stared at me like she could see down into the deepest places inside me. "You met the little girl?" she asked with a blank expression. My bandmates all exchanged looks of incredulity. Sarah collected herself and a new smile spread across her face. She said, "Don't listen to anything that little brat says. She's a liar through and through. Look, why don't you guys come down to the ranger station with me? It'll be safer together." She pointed behind herself into the woods. Something lit up in my brain. This was the second time a stranger had tried to coax us into the dark. We weren't going to get robbed. Something much worse was about to happen. Pierce seemed to have come to the same conclusion. and he invited Sarah to instead join us around the fire. As he did with the little girl, he knew Sarah would decline. The strange woman told us she had to get back before it got any colder. And with that, she turned and hurried into the woods. After a long debate about what to do, we decided that hiking back to the truck was the fastest way to get lost or killed. We hadn't used a trail and our phone batteries were low. Every time the wind blew, it set 1,000 trees groaning and shivering, which made it impossible to orient ourselves by sound. And it was so black that if I stared into the darkness long enough, I started having minor hallucinations as my brain tried to make sense of the void. So we kept the fire blazing and agreed to sleep in two-person shifts. Since Pierce and I were the soberest of the bunch, we agreed to stay up first. But only an hour into our watch, we started hearing the coughs and sputters of the little girl in the distance. I followed Pierce to the lake's edge, which lay about 30 yards from our camp. There, we heard an eerie voice wafting on the breeze. I saw the silhouette of a person milling about near the water a few hundred feet away, and realized it was the girl. She was wandering around in the dark, singing. We booked it back to the fire and woke Jeff and Ronnie up, alerting them to the girl's presence. But as we discussed what to do, another voice erupted from nearby and began singing as well. It sounded like Sarah. Pierce and I jumped into the tent with the other guys and sealed it up, terrified that the time had come for whatever these creeps had planned. But no one approached our camp. The two people just walked in slow half circles behind the trees, singing together in a language I couldn't identify. Ronnie always keeps a menacing-looking trail knife on him whenever we go hiking, and he scrambled for it while shouting that he'd butcher anybody who came near us. His yelling caused the people outside to go quiet for a few moments. I pulled out my phone to record some of the voices, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely operate it. I caught a little bit of the girl. But then, something even weirder happened. None of us are certain how many people were in the woods, but we heard a third voice at that moment. It was deeper and guttural, like the sound of some night predator stalking around in the jungle. I'm not certain the noise was made by a person. Ronnie and Jeff believe the sound is coming from the little girl, who has a coughing fit and then begins channeling some demonic voice. Pierce and I think it's a third person or an animal that was with them, waiting for us to leave the safety of the bonfire. I'm going to play the recording for you now, so I apologize for the poor quality. After the commotion, the activity in the woods died down for a while. The guys and I remained inside the tent, terrified, only leaving its shelter to throw more wood on the fire about once an hour. None of us slept, and for the rest of the night, we occasionally heard distant singing, laughing, coughing, and the occasional whisper. Sometimes the girl would say, "Can you help us?" in the exact same tone, as if her voice had been recorded and replayed over and over again. We also heard someone, probably Sarah, climbing a nearby tree and shouting things like, "I can see you, boys!" and "Let's go together, it's safe now!" And that was it. By dawn, we were exhausted from terror and half frozen in the tent. The noises stopped and the people, if they even were people at all, had long abandoned their efforts to lure us into the dark. We packed up and hiked back to the truck, which had thankfully not been ransacked. As far as I'm concerned, the next time I go camping, it'll be in a treeless desert in Arizona.